Hello and welcome to the IEDC 95th Anniversary Leaders in Economic Development interview series. In this session, I'm joined by Maury Forman, retired senior manager with the Washington State Department of Commerce. Maury, thanks so much for being here today. It's great to talk with you.
Thanks for letting me be at my home.
So let's start with your personal career path. Can you tell me how you got involved with economic development?
Sure. Well, after college, I joined a theater group, and because I decided what I wanted to do was be an actor and a stand-up comic. After about a year, I realized that I couldn't act and I wasn't funny. So I went back to school and got a degree. And then I entered the healthcare profession for a while, for about 18 years in various jobs. And then after that, I moved to economic development for the next 30 years, and the rest is history.
Well, that is definitely quite the journey. So my next question is really about the skills that you acquired over time. So maybe there's some skills that you pulled from your acting, stand-up comedy, or healthcare fields that really helped transition to economic development throughout your career.
Yeah, I think there were quite a number of skills that I had to carry over. I mean, to be honest with you, I really wasn't sure how I got this job. I probably got this job like many other people moving into economic development. They became unemployed and started applying for any job they possibly could find that was out there, whether they were qualified or not. I was lucky enough to find somebody, I applied for a job that I found in the newspaper about economic development, and I had no idea what economic development was. I looked it up. It had a 47-word definition, and I said, sure, I could try and do that. So I got an interview. I passed the interview thanks to people who believe that you didn't need an education in economic development because you could think outside the box, and that's what I did. In the skills, well, certainly, as I had mentioned, I was an economic development virgin, but I consider myself pretty much more of an educator rather than a practitioner. So one of the first skills I thought that was very important to have was to try and find the people who were the smartest people in the profession and get an idea of what economic development was and what sort of curriculum I needed to develop in economic development for the practitioners in the Northwest. So that was a pretty important skill that I wanted to do. And the second skill I brought in was the idea of trying to incorporate humor into an education curriculum for something like economic development, which was never considered to be a really fun profession to be in. So I think the idea of being able to do that really was a benefit and helped the program a great deal. I think the other skill that I thought was important was the idea of listening to the practitioners themselves. We went to go see the practitioners. We talked to them, find out what they wanted to do. And we conducted everything from front porch economic development. You know, front porch economic development is the idea of bringing people together like they used to on front porches and talking about the issues of the day and what was important to them. So we did that. We did a number of front porch economic developments. And we also did a number of mystery shopping tours where we worked with the economic developer to know nothing about a community and go into that community as though we were tourists, and to recognize, you know, from their website, from their entryways, their signage, their downtowns, just talking to people and find out what they thought of the community. And then we bring a presentation. We took probably 100 pictures, Roger Brooks and I, of the community, and then presented them to people so that they could see their community from the eyes of somebody who was not familiar with it. So those are the skills that I thought were pretty important that I had and that I brought to the table.
Great. Well, what about some challenges that you had to face through your career, whether they're personal or professional, but something that as you were making your way through economic development kind of came up and you had to find a way to overcome?
Well, once again, the first skill was I didn't know anything about economic development, you know, so I really had to figure out what that was. Fortunately, I had some people that could help me with that. But the other, I think, challenges that we had was, number one, I was from the state. And there was always some wariness among local practitioners about the state because the state always thinks that we know more about economic development than the practitioners do, and that really wasn't true. So we had to convince people, number one, that the state wanted to work with them and not against them. Okay, so that was probably one of the earlier challenges that we had. I think another challenge that we had was basically the idea of getting people to recognize that education needed to be an important part of their professional development, that it was there to help them. At the time, most people weren't going to any classes. There was no education and training established in Washington State. We did have the basic course that was taking place in Portland, but what had happened was the gentleman who was doing that program passed away, and then I worked with people in Business Oregon to put together a program in Washington that ended up being the basic course for economic development. So the challenges are, number one, being from the state, we had to overcome that. Number two, getting people to recognize the importance of education, because let's face it, those people, especially in rural communities, they were working 67 hours a week, and they did not have the time to go to school and learn economic development for somebody who wasn't even a practitioner.
Well, earlier on in your answer, you mentioned something about people helping out. And so I wanted to talk to you about mentorship. Is there anybody during your kind of development through your career that really helped mentor you get into economic development? And then also wanted to have you touch a little bit on how you've incorporated mentorship towards the end of your career as you were wrapping up.
Well, I can't say I had formally or officially a mentor, but I did have two supervisors who were extremely beneficial in not only helping me understand economic development, but allowing me to go outside the box. John Roberts was one of my supervisors, as well as Deb Knutson, who hired me for the job. And they were just wonderful. I mean, not only were they really smart people, Deb was a brilliant economic developer. People loved her in the communities. And John was equally as smart and really did a good job of running the department at the time. In addition to that, I was fortunate because I developed a partnership with Business Oregon, and I was able to work with Carolyn Meese, Jill Miles, and Denny Houle, who sort of were, who became partners in the basic economic development course that we established. It wasn't a Washington course, it was a business Oregon, or it was an Oregon and a Washington course. And they were really so helpful in making sure that they got the information and helped develop the curriculum that was important. And then I was there to try and add some humor and to sort of put some fun, interactive activities in as well. And I just want to do a shout out real quick to Mark Barbash, who is from Ohio, who I met at an IEDC session, who taught the basic course in Washington in finance. No doubt, finance, not a fun course to teach. It's a little slow moving. Mark did a great job of not only teaching that course in a fun and interactive way, but created a finance Jeopardy game, which I just thought was so much fun. The participants loved it. From then on out, I was coming up with economic development curriculum, like the dating game for site selectors and communities, economic development Jeopardy, who wants to be an economic developer. I probably created a dozen games with people from the Business Oregon group in order to do that. And the other thing that I thought was unique is, because we knew that people were going to be taking time to come to these courses, is that Business Oregon and Washington State developed a scholarship program for anybody that wanted to attend the basic course. They could do it for free. And shortly thereafter, Idaho joined us and provided scholarship money for their people. Montana joined us as well. Hawaii even joined us. And later on, British Columbia did as well. And by the way, British Columbia now has a great basic course that they have developed on their own. So I've learned a great deal from a lot of people, many of whom I have met at the IEDC courses and leadership conferences, and certainly the annual conferences.
Great, thanks. So I want to talk a little bit about how economic development as a field has evolved. So can you tell me how you've seen the field of economic development, the profession, evolve and change throughout the course of your career?
Sure, it has changed substantially since I got in. There used to be a time when people went to where the jobs are, and now the jobs are going to where the people are. And now, even now after the pandemic, what's taking place now is that there's more remote working. And as a result, businesses are going to have to start worrying less about workforce development and more about workplace development. And I think that's something that we're going to see more of in the future. The other thing that was happening 20, 30 years ago is that the emphasis was always placed on business recruitment. I mean, business recruitment was the sexy part of economic development. Nobody wanted to do business retention expansion. It was always considered to be the Rodney Dangerfield of economic development. It never got any respect at all. Why? Because It was always about business recruitment, business attraction. And that was the part where economic developers got to cut a ribbon. They got to shovel dirt from one side of the road to the other. They got to get their picture in the paper with an elected official and talk about the number of jobs that they were going to be bringing into their community in the next 5, 10, and 15 years down the drain. If communities had their choice, they would always choose business recruitment and business attraction. That's just happened to be the way it was back then. It's sort of like watching a bear open up a safe. You know, a lot of effort, but very little results. I like to think of business attraction as Halloween. You know, when you have Halloween, it's a little scary. People become obsessive about it. It's time consuming. It's even expensive to some extent. Those are all the things that the same thing with business attraction. The difference, however, is that you know that Halloween is going to come to your community at least once a year. You can't say that the same thing that a business is going to be relocating into your community at least once a year. So those are the things that we needed to be dealing with, because business recruitment was sort of the mantra that drove economic development for the last 50, 60 years. And while a vital aspect of economic development, it was not the only thing that would stimulate and sustain economic growth in a community. And we needed to have a new consciousness in economic development. And that new consciousness really was, there's more to economic development than business recruitment. And so I would say that if you look at the IEDC agendas from 30 years ago, and then look at them now, there's just so much change that has taken over. I mean, back then, everybody wanted to get, the site selector sessions were packed. Everybody wanted to attend those. They always wanted to have that one-to-one face conversation and getting a site selector to go into their community. And now look at the agenda. The agenda consists of talent attraction. The agenda consists of entrepreneurship. It consists of disaster preparation. We even have new vocabulary. You would not find the vocabulary that we're talking about now in economic development in the vocabulary 20, 30 years ago. I mean, now we're talking about broadband. We didn't talk about broadband 30 years ago. We're talking about Zoom towns. Zoom towns, what are Zoom towns? We're talking about Lions, local investment opportunity networks. We're talking about more local activities. We're talking about co-working spaces, maker spaces. We're talking about makers, doers, dreamers. You know, they make up a third of the economy right now. Startups and entrepreneurs create probably 80 to 95% of the jobs in the United States right now. So business recruitment has sort of taken a back seat. Rural has become really prevalent and recognized how important it is. Diversity, all of these are things that we didn't do back then, which now we're talking about. And thankfully, the IEDC is including it in its program as well.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, in this series, we've talked to a number of people that have experience with economic development at the community, local, regional, state, and federal levels. And so with your background with the state, working mostly on rural area, I'm curious to see what your take is on how economic development at that level kind of is different from what you might experience at other levels, the local community level. Or kind of at what IEDC does at the national level?
Well, it's a complicated issue, to be honest with you. But if I had to separate the three, we talk about the idea that the federal government's responsibility is what we call the 3 R's. And it's relief, it's recovery, and it's reform. Relief for those people who really need it, distressed communities, the poor, the underserved. Recovery of the economy, begin to invest more money into the economy, and reform in the sense that we really need to work on our preparedness. We need to be aware of both disaster preparation that could take place, natural disasters, as well as economic disasters. And that's the responsibility pretty much, I think, of the federal government. The state, on the other hand, is the conduit for a lot of the money that flows down into the communities. And it's their responsibility to make sure that that money gets flowing into the communities correctly and legally, you know, without fraud. And then you have the local areas, and they're responsible for making sure they create a healthy community. And when you think about it, it's the locals where all the work gets done anyway. I mean, it's all about local as far as I'm concerned. And as a result, when you have a local economy, you have something that really needs to focus on the startups and entrepreneurs and the people in the community there. I think if you used a business analogy to that, you can think of it in the sense that like Amazon and Walmart, Microsoft are the federal government. I mean, let's face it, they run everything. They have influence, they have power, they have money. There's your federal government. The next step down are second stage companies. Second stage companies such as, which are second stage companies, for those who don't know, are companies that have maybe employees from 10 to 99 employees and make $50, $100 million. They have money, by the way, but what they need to do is they need to grow. They need to figure out how they can get more money, create more things that people will buy, and sort of resolve problems as well. That's the states. And then you have the locals, and you have people, you have startups with 1 to 10 employees, let's say. That's the local government right there. They don't have a lot of money, but they do need to come up with some creative and innovative ideas into how they can stimulate the economy. So that's, I don't know. I just made that up, by the way. I don't know whether it really means anything or whether it's true or not. But, if you had to put a business analogy to it, that's the way I would think of how the government works.
Pretty impressive to make up on the spot. Thank you.
I don't know if it's even true, but I'd have to give it more thought, before I did anything like that.
Well, my next question is, we talked earlier about the skills that you developed throughout your career and how you pulled on some of your early experiences through economic development. So my question to you now is, what is one of the most important skills that one would need to be in economic development?
The most important skills, probably to listen to the local folks. Let's start with that. I said that earlier. The other thing I would think would be more about being innovative and creative. We need to be open to new ideas. When you see a successful artist, whether it's a musician or a dancer or whoever, a successful artist, you sort of say to yourself, boy, that person is really creative and innovative and things like that. When you see a successful business person, you normally say, gee, that person must really be smart. We have a lot of smart people in economic development. I think what we need are a lot of more innovative, creative people who have come up with things like local investment opportunity networks, more different ways to get access to capital in non-traditional ways. Thinking of more strategies like economic gardening that came about a number of years ago, taking a look at other people and what they're looking at and what they're doing for best practices and bring them to your community. That's essentially what we did. We have a gentleman on our staff right now who's head of marketing and communications who came from private industry, who's probably saved the department millions of dollars because he does most things in-house, but he's also very creative, and he's created a great website of resources and tools for entrepreneurs and economic developers in Washington State. So we're lucky to have him. Rob Zer's his name, if I give him a shout out here.
Thanks. And then one last question for you is, if someone's getting into the field, or for practitioners that are already in the field, do you have any recommendations for books of what would be something that would really be a great taste of what to expect in economic development?
Yeah, I do. What a coincidence. I just happen to have 2 of the books here. One of the books is called Our Town, and it's a book by James Fallows and Deborah Fallows. And what it is they crisscrossed all over the United States in a little biplane, and they stopped in places that used to be really distressed, underserved places, and they interviewed people who have markedly made a change in the entire community because of the work that they have done. I have marked this book more often than any other book that I've looked at because it gives people lots of ideas. And I think that's what we need to look at. We don't need to create new ideas, really. We need to look at what our neighbors are doing successfully and bring them back into our communities. And essentially this book will do that. It gives you, there must be at least 100 different ideas that we could have brought back in Washington State, many of which we could do here. And it consists of people working together, by the way. In other words, there used to be a time, once again, when economic developers, workforce developers, and community developers, they all went their separate ways. But it was ridiculous because all those people needed to have one strategy rather than 3 different strategies because they were going in different directions. So I think what's happened now, thankfully, is that more and more before the pandemic and even more so now, workforce folks, community development folks, and economic development folks are working together. And I think that's what they need to do in order to have a common strategy to help stimulate the economy. The other book I'm going to talk about is called Master Your Disaster. And it's a book by Leanne Hackman Carty. And it is a book that is almost built for businesses and economic developers. There's even a section in there about economic development activities as practitioners and what they need to do. It's a very easy to read book, but it also comes with about 100 different ideas about how we need to prepare and recover from disaster preparation. And I don't know whether we were talking offline or not, or whether this is something I already mentioned, but the IEDC has done a really great job with their Restore Your Economy website. They partner with the EDA. It is a brilliant website that people should take advantage of and take a look at so that we can be prepared for the next pandemic or natural disaster or even economic disaster that's going to take place.
That's great. And I do want to leave a little bit of time for you to elaborate on something we talked about or bring up something new that we haven't discussed yet. So I'll give you the next few minutes to kind of take the field wherever you'd like to.
Well, I think one of the things that economic developers need to learn, maybe 2 things, 2 most important skills they need to come into the profession with, is number 1, patience. Long time ago, when everybody was doing business recruitment, it sometimes took 12 to 18 months from the time that a site selector visited a community in order to make a decision. Now, obviously, technology has changed that, and people can make decisions a lot quicker now. But we need to sort of still maintain some patience. Sure, we don't need to wait 12 to 18 months, but I think the role of the economic developer really needs to be that it provides tools and resources to communities so they can make not just a decision, but make good decisions as well. And that goes for the same thing as an entrepreneur, and that we need to be more entrepreneurial in the way we act as economic developers. I mean, that's the first thing. The second thing is partnerships. Partnerships are really important. Whether you're in workforce development, economic development, or community development, we need to figure out how we can work together. We need to also include business and industry in the work that we do to make sure that they're a part of the successes that we hope to have. And we also need to work with other states. Right, economic development has been real competitive. We always think of other states as being competitive. When Jill Miles and Carolyn Meese and Denny Hool and I got together, we wanted to make sure that education was not competitive, that we were to act as partners, that not only resulted in education for people, but also it resulted in partnerships and friendship that we had as well. And I think that's one of the things that the IEDC really needs to be proud of doing. The IEDC has recognized that education is really not just about the filling of the pail. It's about more the idea about the lighting of the fire and stoking that fire with wisdom and friendship and knowledge. I mean, those are the things that the IEDC really gave me, and I'm forever thankful for that that opportunity to be a part of the IEDC.
Well, Maury, thanks so much for being here and talking with me today. I really appreciate you being part of this interview series.
Sure, thank you.